We're going to talk to someone who's going to be making a presentation at the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society, and whose last name is long been associated with the shipping and shipbuilding industry in this area. We are pleased to say good morning to Helen DeFoe. Helen, good morning.
Good morning, Art.
Thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you for having me on your program.
Sure. Let's start out with some of the basics, the whens and wheres of your presentation to the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society.
It will be at the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society Museum and Store, which is in the Bay County. I've forgotten the name. I'm not in Bay City anymore, so I don't know the locations as well. The Bay Town Center, I believe it's called, on Wilder Road.
Okay, yeah.
It's inside that mall there, right next to the Zales jewelry store. And it will be Saturday night at 6:30.
So, I assume, and I know that's a bad word, Helen, but I assume with your last name and what you're doing with the Marine Historical Society that you have some history of your family's involvement in shipbuilding.
Yes, I do. My grandfather was Harry DeFoe's kid brother. Harry was the one who founded the shipyard in 1905.
Went back that far?
Yes, 1905. And my grandpa was the younger brother who also worked for his older brother, the dynamo behind the yard there. So this was my father's father.
So, back then, Helen, were they building steel ships or were they still building wooden ones?
In the very beginning, in 1905, they were just barely above rowboats. They were building a lot of very small launches. And what got Harry going in the business before they started getting into the wooden yachts was what they called kit boats. And it was put together like a kit. They were also called KD, or knockdown boats. And these would be a whole frame that would be assembled in the yard, and every piece would be marked and noted so that then the kit would be taken apart. It could be shipped very easily, much easier and cost-effective than shipping an intact boat. And then when it arrived at the new owner's location, they would just note those markings on the pieces of wood, and they could reassemble that boat themselves. Their first steel boats were built for the Navy. That was later on.
That was where I was getting to, because I do know that they did an awful lot of work for the Navy. The Edson, while not built here, is representative of that class, isn't it?
Correct.
How many did they build of those? How many destroyers came out of the Defoe shipyard? Do we know?
Yes, destroyer escorts were one thing that they built a little bit more of. The destroyer is a little bit larger, and they built primarily during wartime. They built 148 Navy and Coast Guard vessels. That was during World War II. I shouldn't say wartime because there were other wars that they built for as well. But World War II was those 148. The patrol craft were the real bread and butter. Those are, they were also called sub-chasers during World War II. And that's what they were able to crank out at one would be produced in just slightly more than a week. They really had a Henry Ford-style conveyor belt system set up almost that they were able to turn those over so quickly.
They almost had to, because the war was raging on and it was needed, wasn't it?
Oh, for sure. Certainly was. And the patrol craft were used especially in the Atlantic to try to counteract the threat that the German U-boats had along the Atlantic coast. Those patrol craft were the sub-chasers.
So they build these craft. How do they get them to the Atlantic? They have to sail them through the St. Lawrence Seaway?
Well, there was no St. Lawrence Seaway that we think of until 1954 when it was started.
Oh.
So this is where my grandpa's role came into play. They had, it seems amazing to think of now, but they had a very circuitous route that ended up in New Orleans down the Mississippi River.
Oh.
And they would sail the vessel under its own power to Chicago, and then through a series of canals and the Illinois River, the Des Plaines River, they would get to the Mississippi. They had to take the superstructure off, of course, because they would be going under bridges. They had to also attach air-filled buoys along the side of the ship to float it up high enough because the Mississippi is shallow. So my grandpa's job, he and Grandma during the war were stationed in New Orleans, and that's where they would take custody of the ship, so to speak, and do all the paperwork and whatnot, turning it over to the Navy.
Now, I know in recent years, I believe somebody found a kit boat, and there's been other examples. Any of the Navy vessels still surviving?
Yes, there are, especially the latter ones, which were landing craft utility. Those were built during the Vietnam War. The ones that were used during wartime, during World War II, the only ones that I know of are a museum, floating museum, like the Edson is, that, as you mentioned, is from another yard.
So, how long did the Defoe shipyard remain in business?
Until the very last day of 1976. The boom years were during World War II and shortly thereafter. But without a war to keep things going, unfortunately, a war was good for the business and for all the Bay City men and women who worked at the yard. The building of ships is limited in Bay City by the bridges that are still in existence. And one of them is a railroad bridge that the Defoe Shipbuilding Company built 2 freighters, 644 feet. But when the freighters started to be being constructed in other yards much bigger, there was just a limit to the size that the Defoe yard could produce. So being an inland yard, not being able to compete with the coastal yards, and having the bridges on the Saginaw River was kind of what did it in.
And that kind of put an end to it, huh? I didn't realize they built freighters. I had is one of them the let me see here, the Daniel Morel. That was one of them, wasn't it? Or no?
Well, that the Hutchinson and the I'm forgetting the name of the other one. Those 2 were built here.
Oh, okay.
Over the years, names changed because owners changed.
Yeah.
So the Morel could have been one of them.
Well, I see now this picture was 1906, so it wasn't.
You're right. That one was built by one of the 3 other big builders in Bay City.
Helen, hang on. I got to take a break, and we'll come back. We're talking to Helen DeFoe, and she's going to be making a presentation this weekend to the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society. We'll tell you more about that, too, when we return.
Taxes was taxing.
All right, we're back with you here on the Art Lewis Show. We are talking to Helen DeFoe from the family whose name was on the shipbuilding business in this area for many, many, many years. She's going to be making a presentation to the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society. That will be this Saturday, the 15th, 6:30 p.m., and it's going to be at the Society's store and museum next to Zales Jewelers in the Bay City Town Center. That, of course, formerly the Bay City Mall on Wilder Road. Helen, have you become the de facto historian of the family name now?
Yes, I guess I have. one nice thing about our family is that we're pack rats. And my dad, who is the youngest of the family, and one of his older brothers, they kind of kept track of all these papers and photos. We have papers going back to back in the 1800s, not about this side of the family, but having pack rats in the family and also having a rather famous business in the family means that there was a lot of interesting information, photographs and whatnot. So my dad and his brother have passed away, and I have a real interest in this. And I've been so pleased to find other people who are interested too, because I have boxes of cool stuff in my living room, and I'm glad to find other people who are interested in it.
Explain to me the, I don't know if it's a debate or not, but the family divergence of how you use the little f and the capital F in the name Defoe.
Yes. Originally, when my grandpa and Harry's grandfather and grandmother came from Canada, they were kind of on the losing side of a minor rebellion there. So they just got in his fishing boat and they ended up in what would become Bay City. This was in 1843, and there were only about 50 residents in what would become all of Bay County. But the last name then was with the uppercase F, capital D-E, capital F-O-E. And so when Harry started out the business, the family name had that uppercase F, and it wasn't begun as Defoe Shipbuilding. It was Defoe Boat and Motor Works. And because of the pack rats in the family, I have old letterheads from very early on in envelopes, which were printed, Defoe Boat and Motor Works, and there's that capital F, that uppercase F. At some point, I don't know quite when, it looks like the 20s or 30s, Harry decided to change his last name and the last name of Defoe Boat and Motor Works, and later on Defoe Shipbuilding. He changed it to the lowercase f, and I've never heard from any of his descendants as to why. I'm just guessing he liked it better on the signs or something.
Yeah, could be.
But so all of his descendants have that lowercase f, and Harry and Art had 4 siblings, and all of their descendants have the uppercase f, but no controversy.
So you mentioned the family were pack rats. In a shipbuilding family that are pack rats, the obvious question is, did you save any of the boats other than the ones in museums that we know about? Does the family own any of the boats that were built by Defoe?
Not that I know of. The earliest boat I know is from 1913, and that is in the museum itself, the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society, and that is just a launch. Mm-hmm. And I happen to have an advertisement for that launch. It cost $130 back then for an 18-foot launch. But there are still some of the yachts from the boom days, which went up to the Depression. Some of those yachts still exist, but I don't know of any in the family itself.
And they were pretty fancy for their time, weren't they?
Very, very elegant. And you had the Roaring Twenties folks with those who had money were willing to spend it on some very elegant yachts. And the ones that are still in existence, these were made in the 20s and 30s. So they have been completely overhauled perhaps several times by some of the millionaires who own them now.
The heyday of the shipbuilding, though, could be attributed to the wars, couldn't it?
Certainly did, yes. After the war, after World War II ended, there were only 7 more yachts that were built at all. But there had already been 77 yachts built up until World War II.
So they were a pretty prolific shipbuilding company.
Yep, did very well. I think you had honest businessmen and very hardworking Bay City and Bay County residents who made it all happen.
So if we look at the 2 major world wars, if we look at World War I and World War II, do we know how many ships Defoe built for the armed forces?
There were a total of about 352 vessels built throughout the history of the whole yard. Now, as I mentioned, 83 of those were yachts. A great many of those remainder would have been military vessels. And so World War I was the first time that the yard received a military contract. That was initially for spent torpedo chasers. There were 5 of those, and then 8 mine planters, 40 feet and 90 feet, respectively. There was also a war that was one of our longest, from 1920 to 1933, the War on Demon Rum, Art. We had Prohibition.
Rum
and
runners.
The Coast Guard, yes, the Coast Guard had 17 rum runner chasers built. And those were wooden boats, and they would have been built in 1924, those rum runner chasers, to chase after the bad guys. So they built for many wars, including the war against the War of Prohibition against alcohol.
I assume because of the name Chaser that these were faster than regular boats.
Yes, they would have been. Yep, you had to keep up with the folks who had a vested interest in having a very fast boat to get away from the Coast Guard.
Has any of this history been documented on film?
I believe that when the yard closed, there was Tom Defoe and Bill Defoe, I should have mentioned them, Harry's 2 sons, who ran the yard after he passed away in 1957. When the yard closed completely, Bill donated all kinds of papers, and I know there are films like almost home movie type films of Defoe Shipyard, employee picnics, etc. They were donated to the Bowling Green University in Bowling Green, Ohio, where there is a Great Lakes Maritime Museum and archives there.
I wonder if
so could be there.
Yeah, I wonder if Rick Mixter, and I think you know Rick or know of him. I wonder if Rick has ever put anything together on Defoe.
That would be great
It'd
to
be
see. I would enjoy that.
Yeah,
yes.
I would too. Hang on, Helen. Got to take a break. We'll come back. We're talking to Helen DeFoe. She will be in Bay City this Saturday at the Bay City, what was the Bay City Mall, now the Bay City Town Center, at 6:30 p.m. She'll be doing a free presentation for the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society in their museum and store. I'll tell you more about it when we return. And we return on the Art Lewis Show talking to Helen DeFoe, the great niece of the Defoe family. She is the great niece of Harry J. Defoe of the Defoe Shipbuilding Company. Helen, I have to ask, I never knew this existed. Tell us about Defoe Island. Where is it, and where was it? Let's put it that way.
Well, it is still there. It was originally when Francis Defoe, Harry's grandfather, came from Canada. It was originally just less than a 4-acre island. And I don't know an acre when I would see one, but I have been out to the island several times, and to me it seems like it would be smaller than 4 acres. It is about 2 miles offshore, just off Bayport and Seaboyne area. And I'm amazed you hadn't heard of a 4-acre island, but it is still called Defoe Island because it was owned and bought from the state by that first Defoe here in the U.S., Francis Defoe. He bought it for $4.76.
Well, the next time I run out the bay, I'm going to have to look at Defoe Island. 4 acres is not big. I mean, my house sits on 1 acre, and 4 of those would not make a big island, to say the least.
No. We don't know if Francis bought it to live on because he was a fisherman and he liked the fishing beds on the east part of Saginaw Bay there the best.
Yep.
He may have lived there during the season, but also one of my uncles thinks perhaps he bought it to use as a source of stakes to stake out the nets. Back then, a trap net was very popular, a funnel-shaped device, and you would have staked that out, left that there permanently, and then you had a sailboat. You didn't have a motorboat in the early days, and so you would have gone and collected the fish from that net. So it's possible that that's why that was fought. There's a much larger island, Mayhew Island, just within spitting distance of Defoe Island. And we do know that Harry's father and wife lived on that bigger island because he was a fisherman as well. And Harry would have been a little kid living on that island with his parents and his poor mother in some primitive conditions, I'm sure, with 4 young children. And she was she had been a school teacher before she married. This is Harry and my grandpa's mother. And she believed in the value of education, so she taught her kids on the island, as well as being a wife and feeding a hired hand and all. So we do know that Defoe's lived on Mayhew Island. Defoe Island is just kind of a fun fact to have in your family.
Yeah, what'd you do on it when you went out there?
Well, we tromped around, as my dad would say. There's a lot of cottonwoods. It's a beautiful spot, birds singing in cottonwoods. Unfortunately, there's a very tall, 10-foot tall reed that's invasive in Saginaw Bay called Phragmites.
Right.
And they have surrounded the whole island, but for, say, 20 yards of a sweet little beach there. So we met a couple who live on shore because we wanted to know which was Defoe Island. Well, we asked the right couple because they took us under their wings, a retired couple who live off of Seaboyne there. And we camped overnight there once on the island. And if you like the water and the bay and cottonwood trees, it's a beautiful little spot. So we've gone there 4 years in a row.
Have you really? Now, where do you live now? Because you said you're not in Bay City anymore.
Yes. My dad worked for the power plants at Consumers there on the bay in Bay City, so we were born there. And he got transferred down here to Jackson, Michigan, which is the headquarters of Consumers.
So you're still in the state,
though. So we moved
though.
when I was 12.
Yeah, you're still in the state.
Yes, certainly am, and I have cousins still in Bay City, so I enjoy coming up, and I love Bay City. I love the big Saginaw River there.
Yeah, because of the nature of the business, I mean, it was a family business. Did all of the family get involved, or did some choose not to?
Well, the younger generation, for instance, like my dad, he didn't, but you would have had, of Harry's 5 siblings, my grandfather, their other brother, Fred, a sister who went by the nickname of Chick. When she was widowed, she came back to work for Harry in her middle age at the yard. So 4 out of the 6 Defoe of Harry's generation. And then in my dad's generation, several of his brothers, Tom and Bill Defoe, of course, Harry's kids. Tom and Bill would have worked there from the day they could probably push a broom. But several of my dad's brothers worked there during summers off from when they were at University of Michigan. So nobody else in my family pursued a career there, but I know Tom's son, young Tom, in my generation, as my parents always called him, to distinctive between Tom Sr. and young Tom. He worked there until the yard closed, and one of Bill's son-in-laws worked there. It was definitely a family organization.
And how many of the family are still around? And do you get together as a family group?
The Harry's descendants are still up in Bay City, 2 of his granddaughters there. I am not as close with that family as far as knowing about reunions, no.
Mm-hmm. All right, hang on. We're going to take one more break, come back and finish up with Helen DeFoe, who's going to be in town this weekend. We'll remind you about that when we return.
for over 80 years. And
all right, and we're back for our final segment with Helen DeFoe, who's going to be doing a special presentation for the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society this Saturday, 6:30 p.m. in the Baytown Center, formerly the Bay City Mall, right next to Zales. That's where their museum and store is located. And it is a different location from where they normally do their presentations. Normally, if I'm correct, they do them in Trinity Episcopal Church, but this time they will be in their store in the mall. Helen, so what can folks expect to see during your presentation? What's it going to be like?
Well, they'll have a heck of a lot of pack rat stuff to look at. I have more than 100 photographs of different things about the yard, and I'm calling it a family history of Defoe Shipbuilding Company. When I lived in Bay City from 0 to 12, I think it was one of those things for my parents that when you live in a town, anything that's famous about it, you take it for granted because it's always been there and you'll always be there. My parents didn't expect for my dad to get transferred here to Jackson. So I don't even remember going to any launchings. I only remember once going to the yard with my grandpa. So as far as personal knowledge of the yard, I don't have that much, but it's amazing with the internet how many details that I've been able to get. So photographs that I've got, I'll be talking about the family, the upper and lowercase f, the island. But I'm also going to have some trivia at the end, I guess you could call it, of what are some of these ships and boats still doing these days. There were 3 destroyer escorts. I take that back. Guided missile destroyers that were built for the Australian Navy. So you can imagine Defoe must have had the best price for the Australians to want to have guided missile destroyers built for them halfway across the world. But I will be talking about, for instance, vessels like that, some of the famous yachts, and probably for folks who know much about Defoe, the most famous vessel found the Titanic in 1985. That was a research vessel that the shipyard built in 1970, and Robert Ballard, the explorer, used that vessel because it had a special propulsion system that would allow it to hold its location in the sea. And through that, he was towing an underwater submersible with the camera looking for the Titanic. And so I'll certainly be talking about that vessel.
That's a ship that was way ahead of its time because now they have marine positioning systems on almost every big ship. It's amazing. Way ahead of their time. Way ahead of their time.
Boat fans and shipyard fans love that connection to history, finding probably the most famous wreck in the world, and it was found by a Defoe boat that was built by Bay City folks.
Well, Helen, I want to tell you this has been a pleasure. Thank you very much for spending the time with us this morning. And again, it's a free program for the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society, and will be a family history of Defoe Shipbuilding Company, Saturday, March 15th, 6:30 p.m. at the Baytown Center, formerly the mall, and right next to Zales Jewelers. Helen, thank you very much, and have yourself a great day.
Thank you, Art. It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
And we will be back to close out the hour.
Arrow, weekdays 5:30 to 9 on WSGW.
All right, that wraps up the first hour of the Art Lewis Show. My thanks to Helen DeFoe for spending the time with us, fascinating about a company well known in this area for shipbuilding, known all over the world for that matter.